has a job of providing guidance to people who are confused on questions like this. It's the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Its chair is Baroness Kishwer Falkner, who is with us in the Today studio. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Nick. Thank you for having me.
I want to take you through some of these knotty problems that people are facing this morning. But before we do that, you're someone who was given the job, but in part because you always believed that the law needed clarifying. You always thought the policy that was being pursued by governments was in a mess. It's been a long old journey, hasn't it?
Yes, it has. I came on board in late 2020 and we consulted for our next strategic plan fairly shortly after that. And I was alarmed to see that 69% of the public, the number one concern expressed to us was about the confusion as to who was eligible, who had what rights in this area. And since then, it has been a long old journey. If I can just briefly tell you what we've done as the regulator. We consulted on the new strategic plan, and in 2021 we backed a court case. We intervened in a court case called Forstater, which clarified in the upper tribunal that gender-critical beliefs were a protected characteristic under religion and belief in the Equality Act.
To be clear, for people who don't follow the detail of this, people who are fighting for women's rights, as they would say it,
yes,
you backed.
Yes, or who believed that biology was significant in a description of what was a man or a woman. That was 2021. In 2022, we published our single-sex spaces exceptions guidance. In 2023, we wrote a long and detailed letter to the government saying we really needed clarity on the Act because so many people were having to go to tribunal and so on. And then in 2024, we intervened in this very significant judgment.
Well, let's try and get some clarity now as to what's going to happen in future. We know you're going to issue guidance. You can't tell us everything now, but let's go through some of the issues that concern people most. Sport, perhaps the most contentious, perhaps the easiest for you to resolve. The president of World Athletics, Sebastian Coe, welcomes this. Is it simple now that trans women cannot take part in women's sport? Those born as men can't take part in women's sport?
Yes, it is. The ruling is enormously consequential, and it does bring clarity. That is undoubtedly the case. It's a very readable judgment, and organisations should be taking care to read it and to understand that it does bring clarity, helps them decide what they should do. So yes, sport, that is correct. That is a correct interpretation.
And for changing rooms, the debate about whether a trans woman can go into a women's changing room, clear again, is it? No is the answer.
Yes, single-sex services, like changing rooms, must be based on biological sex. If a male person is allowed to use a women-only service or facility, it isn't any longer single-sex. Then it becomes a mixed-sex space. But I have to say there's no law that forces organisations, service providers, to provide a single-sex space. And there is no law against them providing a third space, an additional space, such as unisex toilets, for example, or changing rooms.
Well, let's come to toilets, because toilets is often one that people, let's be honest, get in quite a lather about. We heard there just a few seconds ago from Jane Fay saying there's a real danger that trans people can't go into any toilet at all now. They're not able as trans women to use a women's toilet, but they wouldn't be welcome in a man's toilet if they're wearing a dress, just to make it explicit. What's your answer to trans people who are worried about that?
Well, there isn't any law saying that you cannot use a neutral third space, and they should be using their powers of advocacy to ask for those third spaces. But I think the law is quite clear that if a service provider says we're offering a women's toilet, that trans people should not be using that single-sex facility.
Now, the
steer from the Supreme Court is quite clear in that regard.
OK, and that's where your guidance will matter. Now, yes. In the event, though, that the campaigners who won their case yesterday, the ones who you supported 4 years ago, say, right, we're now going to carry on this fight. We are going to go to law. Will they get the support of the Equality and Human Rights Commission? Do you want to now pursue organisations, public bodies and others who you think are still not preserving women's rights?
Nick, we're going to have a new statutory code of practice. Statutory meaning it'll be the law of the land. It'll be interpreted by courts as the law of the land. We're hopefully going to have that by the summer. If we're responsible for 9 protected characteristics, not only these 3, in other words, sex, gender reassignment, and sexual orientation, there's 6 others. We evaluate when the law is not being followed, and we make a case-by-case decision as to whether to have conversations, to use a bigger rod, to use enforcement, compliance tools, or whatever. We will be continuing to do that.
The law is one of those tools. Let's talk about another area that people worry about, which is the health service. Access to women-only wards, for example. Again, what worries some people, not just those who are trans women themselves, but people who worry about them being treated with dignity and respect, is, well, where do they get treated? Now, are you saying that the health service may not have trans women on women's wards?
We've been speaking to the health service for actually an inordinately long time, and they keep telling us they're going to produce new guidance. I think we will now be asking them when they expect to produce that new guidance. They now have clarity. There is no confusion as of yesterday at 10:30 in the morning. They can start to implement the new legal reasoning and produce their exceptions forthwith.
But they have to change it, do they? Because they have a document, the NHS guidance, that says trans people should be accommodated according to the way they dress, their name, their pronouns. That is no longer the case. That has to change.
Yes, that's correct.
And you will pursue it if it doesn't change?
Yes, we will. We will be having conversations with them to update that guidance.
Now, you made clear that one of the things you do in the Equality and Human Rights Commission is have to protect the rights of trans people and to say that they may not be discriminated against. What is it that they now have rights to have or not to have? Where can they come to you if they're concerned about discrimination?
There are 3 areas of there's direct discrimination, indirect discrimination, harassment, and of course there's sex discrimination. They are covered through the gender reassignment protected characteristic, and they're also covered by sex discrimination.
Give us an example, though, so it becomes real for people.
Well, I think we'll have to flesh this out in the reasoning, but I think if you were to have an equal pay claim, then depending on which aspect of it that it was, you could use sex discrimination legislation.
So trans people would be able to...
Can I give you another,
yes,
a harder example, a clearer example? If a trans person was fired, lost their employment because they happened to be trans, that would be unlawful.
Still, clearly.
Absolutely unlawful.
Now,
and we stand ready to support those people and those claims.
Now, it's interesting that you say that, because you don't need telling, but the audience maybe do, that your position on this issue has brought you extraordinary level of personal grief. There have been bottles of urine left outside your building. A suspicious device was at the building. You faced bullying claims which seemed to come from staff who simply disagreed with your views on this. Has it taken quite a toll on you, this argument?
I think a former chair of EHRC, Trevor Phillips, described this as one of the 3 most difficult public jobs in the UK. I hadn't quite realised how true that was till I was about 4 or 5 months into the role. It's now been 4.5 years. It is the most valuable thing I have done. And I think I have done it with a sense of needing integrity, trying to meet the highest standards of public service that I personally could. It has taken a toll. That's inevitable. But if you're in public service, you've got to have the resilience to cope with that.
But you were described as a Nazi who wants to dehumanise trans people.
Yes, I found that almost amusing because I'm very familiar with German culture. I'm married to a German. And I found that quite amusing because clearly the person who said that had no clue of the history of fascism at all. And it's a shame.
4 long years for you. Do you, as some people do today, think this is a victory merely for common sense?
Yes, I think that's a very good way to put it. It's a victory for common sense, but only if you recognise that trans people exist, they have rights, and their rights must be respected. Then it becomes a victory for common sense. It's not a victory for an increase in in unpleasant actions against trans people. We will not tolerate that. We stand here to defend trans people as much as we do anyone else. So I want to make that very clear.
Finally, Baroness Falkner, 4 long years. It's not over, is it? This argument's going to go on and on.
I think the next stage of litigation may well be tests as to the efficacy of a GRC.
A gender recognition certificate.
Gender recognition certificate and or other areas.
Some people think they're now worthless.
Yes. Well, we don't believe they are. We think they're quite important. But I think there will be other areas. I mean, the government is thinking of digital IDs. And if digital IDs come in, then what documentation will provide the identity of that person? So it's going to be a space that we'll have to watch very carefully as we go on.
Baroness Falkner, Chair of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you.